Hello everyone and welcome to this Spoil Heap chat. We've managed to grab Helen here and we've got some of your fantastic questions that you sent in. So are you ready, Helen?
As ready as I'll ever be.
Okay, yeah, I'll kick us off. So from Namiri Verdstiller, a really good question this, and this is one we've had a few times. I'm a St John's Ambulance volunteer. I know there isn't a direct connection, but I'd love to know what the links are between St John's Ambulance and Knights Hospital.
Well, I didn't know there wasn't a direct connection because everything I've been finding out is really surprising at how much you can see the trail from one to the other. So things like that, when they get welcomed into the I keep wanting to call it the order, into the St John's Ambulance, they actually do a little oath in Latin for faith and in the service of humanity, and they also have to swear loyalty to the Queen and that kind of thing. And it's actually a proper kind of God and country thing, and not only that, but the people who run it are still called the prior, which is pretty incredible.
So there's a lot of links in the practices. And, wow.
Yes, and just in terminology, and you get the feeling that they're always remembering St John and the Maltese cross, and yeah, it's amazing.
Another question then, Helen, if that's okay. We've had one from Graham Domkins. Obviously we're looking for, we're investigating this preceptory. I'll get there eventually. Site, but what makes a preceptory?
Well, what makes a preceptory is, you could answer that in lots of ways. You could say, what are the physical elements that you need? A chapel, a medieval preceptory, you need a barn to keep your stuff in, that you're making your income to go and fund the order fighting in the Mediterranean. And you're going to need somewhere to live and to entertain your visitors, because you've got to be hospitable, and you've got to somewhere to look after the sick, because you've got to have the hospital elements as well. But the thing that makes it a preceptory is that it's owned by the order and it has a preceptor who's running it. But we keep using the word preceptory, but there's a substantial number of people who will use a different word and they will call it a commandery.
Ooh. And
I think there's a commandery, there's even a museum or something in Worcester that's called the commandery. And some people say that a commandery is Templar and a preceptory is Hospitaller, or the other way around. Ooh. And this has been driving me mad. And finally I found someone who can cut the Gordian knot and said, a preceptory is essentially what it's called in Latin, and the commandeur, the commandery, is what it is called in French. So they're the same thing in different languages. So few. We can call them what we like, but I prefer preceptory because commandery sounds like someone's going out commanding. It brings all sorts of baggage, and preceptory doesn't.
Yeah, and to be honest, we've only just managed to pronounce preceptory.
So we can start saying commandery. Is it?
I wasn't going to learn a new word.
No, you succeeded with that one. Move on to the next challenge.
So another really good question. This one's from Carl Johnson, and we know you've been kind of buried in the history books for the whole time you've been here.
Nearly buried.
But this one goes back to the records we found on Malta and how they can help inform the excavation, but also hint at what we might find. So how have they helped the project as a whole?
Well, they have. It's a list of what was there in 1338, but not a full list necessarily, because you can't assume that something that isn't mentioned wasn't there, because we know from other places that there were things that weren't mentioned. A bit like Doomsday Book. In fact, the whole thing's very much like Doomsday Book. It's also got a kind of an assessment of what would be expected to go to the Mediterranean, to the headquarters in Rhodes at that time, to help with the objectives of the order. So it's got all the estates all around and how much they yield per year. Most recently, we've also got another set of accounts that have come in from 1427. That Stuart went to a record office and they unrolled it, and he just got his camera and went because he was in such a hurry, and he came back with all these photos and he didn't know what he had. So we've been stitching them together in Photoshop, and they've been read, and there are a few really good nuggets in there. So if we hadn't been able to get the one from Malta, we'd have had something. But you've got to the trade of the historian is to read that and pull out the nuggets of what's important. And one of the things that's important is how much money, because that gives you an idea of the economic basis, and so how they're integrating in the landscape, because all the money comes out of the land. But another thing is just what the activities and the snapshot it gives you.
And that feeds into another really good question from Hunt, who's asked how many people would have worked in the preceptory. Do we have any sense of that?
Oh, now that is a brilliant question. That is a question like a reenactor asks you or an illustrator, and you haven't had to worry, you haven't bothered to think, and somebody asks you how many people would have been employed or living
here,
working.
living and working.
Well, we've got an idea of the number of people who are living here because I did tot them up from the visitation. So they say they've got to pay the salaries of there's the person who's in charge and one other knight or sergeant. So there's not very many actual members of the order. But then they've got the bailiff, and they've got somebody who holds the keys, so like a porter, and they've got a cook, and they've got the cook's boy, who presumably helps the cook, and they've got 2 servants at the table. And when we added all these people up, we thought that around 20 inside the enclosure, with only 2 of them being hospitallers. But then outside, they've got lots of little estates, each one of which will have people who work on the land, and if they're big enough, they'll have a bailiff. So they've got Dolgunwall, which I've been practicing my Welsh place names. That's Meadow of St Cunwall. Dolgunwall, which becomes Ysbyty Ifan, which means Hospital of John. So it's obviously so that changes its name when it becomes owned by the hospitallers. That's really big, and that's got a whole staff. And Ysbyty, of course, is it being hospital. It's got a whole staff to look after pilgrims because it's in a remote place. So it would really, really vary. So the whole workforce, I would have thought, would run over 100 for this, for Halston as the controlling office for the whole of the North Welsh properties. But here, if you're thinking of catering, for instance, yes, you need to brew beer for 20. You need to bake bread for 20. That's a lot, isn't it? Yeah.
It is a lot.
Change the sheets, do all the washing.
A chaplain as well, presumably?
There's 2 chaplains, actually, because they have one for the chapel here, and then they supply one for Whittington Castle.
So it wasn't a shared chaplain. That's interesting.
Well, shared chaplain, or they've, because Whittington Castle originally founded, they gave the land for the preceptory. I suppose there's a quid pro quo. We give you the land. You're our tame religious specialists. Can you please supply us a chaplain? It's really pay for a chaplain because the chaplains are priests, but the brothers here, the actual hospitallers, are not priests, so they can't say mass. They can't do any of the useful stuff. So they employ chaplains. It's a bit counterintuitive.
But final question here from Stuart Sutcliffe. He's wondering, do we think we're going to find graves on the site as the trenches start to go in? And if so, what might we find with them?
We are. Now, this was something that I was very keen on knowing, because there's a stone coffin in the porch under the tower. Right. There's a very, very heavy monolithic stone coffin, not the lid, just the bottom. And Richard Morris pointed out that you only get this kind of thing on monastic sites. And of course, we've all gone round monasteries and seen all these stone coffins, but you don't put 2 and 2 together and think, okay, that's here. But I don't seem to have seen any elsewhere. And I suddenly thought, oh yeah, they are. They're always in monasteries. Laycock Abbey's got loads where they filmed Harry Potter. The early ones, anyway. And so what I really wanted to know was, I mean, he said you don't bring it from a distance, and we know that there was a monastic order here, so it's likely to be from here. But I thought, well, where there's one, I mean, could we not find another one in situ? But as to what you'd find in them, now that is a really interesting question, because normally a medieval burial won't have anything. People are not buried in their clothes and with their jewellery, except when they are. And when they are is when they're king. So Edward one of the Edwards, Edward III, I think, is buried with an enormous great brooch full of jewels. And archbishops are buried with their rings. And croziers and various other things. So it's almost as like symbols of office, or if you're, I don't know about top aristocrats, or if it's just kings that are buried with jewellery. So I expect that the ideal is that, we've taken a vow of poverty. No, we can't possibly be buried with anything. But we're terribly important. We do have this, we do have this ring that shows how important we are. So we'll just pop it on, But yeah, I don't know. I think that's one of those situations where not very many of them have been excavated of medieval burials in stone coffins in the modern era. So I would say there shouldn't be anything. But if there was anything, well, that would be interesting.
That's something that could be very exciting.
Thank you, everybody, for sending in your questions for the team. We'll carry on catching up with more of the cast as the days go on. But keep sending them in. Thank you, Helen.
Pleasure.
Time Team will be investigating AngloSaxon Cemetery in East Anglia. This amazing site, put forward by Dr. Helen Geake, presents a wonderful opportunity to help shed new light on often elusive Anglo-Saxon archaeology.
We are trying to identify features that are cut within the natural there. So there could be burials in this trench,